Sounds good.
Sounds good to me too.
In the background, observing the panel. If you've been here before, you'll be no strangers to the format. And, I'm Mark Vanderzijl, work for Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures, supporting a lot of startups and inventors in the community. But the goal here was that I bring in a panel of people with firsthand experience who can help kind of guide us through some general topics around entrepreneurship or more specific. And today, the focus will be on regulatory strategy. So we've assembled a panel of people who've both been through the process and helped others go through the process. Our hope is that this can help you learn some of the best practices and maybe as importantly, some pitfalls or mistakes that you may want to avoid. Hopefully Peter's able to join us any minute. I know sometimes there's some hiccups with the unique link that panelists join, but in the meantime, I was hoping maybe Kelliann, if you want to start by introducing yourself and let people know a bit of your background.
Sure. So thanks so much, Mark, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. So about me, I previously worked in the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. So more specifically, I was in the Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices group, acting as an engineering lead reviewer of pre-market submissions. So I was part of that team that reviewed pre-market submissions. I also worked on different projects there, like guidance documents, standards, and workshops. But however, after pursuing what I like to call a career augmentation to become a nurse, I got the opportunity to work with JHTV, first as a Commercialization Academy Fellow, and now as a regulatory mentor in residence, working with students, faculty, and other startups, and helping them better understand medical device regulation and develop their initial regulatory strategy.
Thanks, Kelliann. I think it's a good story of how, you were at Hopkins, learned about Tech Ventures, got engaged, and then we wouldn't let you leave, right? So we've roped you in now as a mentor, which is great. David, do you want to go next? Give the elevator pitch for who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks, Mark, for inviting me. My name is David Narrow. Originally was a biomedical engineer, did the CVID program at Hopkins as part of the biomedical engineering master's degree. It's basically a biodesign program with medical device design and entrepreneurship curriculum. As part of that program, I invented technology that's become the basis for a company I now lead called Sonavex. But before we actually spun out the intellectual property and started working with Tech Ventures, I did a stint doing healthcare strategy consulting up in Boston, where we engaged with mostly late private and public companies on various different business issues they were trying to figure out. So financial forecasting, market research, M&A due diligence, building cost effectiveness models for them, et cetera. So then I came back to Baltimore and then spun out our technology, which includes both an implantable device and an imaging device that helps a number of different patient populations, but we spent the most time in the dialysis market. So we can share a little bit more about that and our experience going through a couple of 510K processes, IDE processes, and many pre-subs along the way.
Thanks, David. And finally, Peter, do you want to give an introduction to who you are and what company you're working with these days?
Sure. So first, I apologize for being a bit late. I had another call that ran over. So I'm Peter Hoban. I am a medical physicist by background. Did my PhD in that area a really long time ago, and I've worked in the clinic, in cancer radiotherapy departments, in academia, and then sort of about halfway through my career, I switched to the industry side and have worked in that area ever since. So with 4 or 5 companies, big and small, mostly in things like collaborations management, product management, which is really what I'm doing now for Oncospace. So I've been exposed to the regulatory area quite a lot, just sort of by necessity, in giving a lot of input to regulatory submissions. So so now at Oncospace, which is a Hopkins spinoff, of course, we are developing radiotherapy software with a lot of AI in it. So I can perhaps talk a little bit about the challenges in getting AI medical devices approved through the FDA. So yeah, that's really my story.
Great, thanks, Peter. And no need to apologize since you're doing us a favor here. So I appreciate you being here and taking the time. For those of you familiar with JHTV, we at Hopkins, we support all 9 schools and faculty and student inventors and licensees of our startups. So we see technologies kind of across the spectrum. It might not surprise most people to know that it's predominantly life sciences and digital health. But I'm wondering if Kelliann, at a very high level, you can just explain what types of things have to be regulated, right? When do you know that you would need to engage a regulatory body like the FDA?
So it's, I guess I could answer from, in a way, an organizational way of introducing you to FDA. So there are different centers primarily that regulate the different products that that they oversee. So that would be things like drugs, biologics, veterinarian products, food and cosmetics, as well as medical devices, and more newly added tobacco products as well. And so that's like a general picture, but then in each center, there are laws that identify definitions of what these products are. And without knowing every single definition by heart, it's tough to say, but those definitions are very good to kind of look back at and see if your product meets the different criteria that are listed there. And I can say one for example, medical devices is often some sort of structure, apparatus that's used to diagnose, treat, or mitigate some sort of health condition. So things like that. Oftentimes that last phrase tends to be probably common across like drugs as well as biologics, because of course there's a medical purpose to most of these products, with exception to food and cosmetics, but those are also a very different regulatory space as well.
I know there's far too much to expect you to be able to go into detail on all of that, so I won't ask you to do that, but I appreciate you just kind of giving a high level. I remember when I first started, there was a panel I went to over at University of Maryland. They showed a clip from the movie Something About Mary. And it's like, how many things in that clip did you see that have to be regulated by the FDA? It was really fun. We kind of went through and it's like, oh, well, that. But it's kind of good to know. Well, the focus today, and as this was kind of marketed and advertised, would be, as you might expect with your background and David's and Peter's, to be focused a bit more on medical devices and software. So if people in the audience or anyone watching the recording later have questions from other verticals, by all means, you still want to connect with us and we can find resources and ways to help. But that'll be predominantly where we focus today. David, when you went through this process with Sonavex, was that the first time that you had gone through FDA approval?
Yep.
What were some of your concerns going into it, or what was like? What did you heard? What did you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the one department of the business that was the most foreign to all of the founders, right? People felt like the clinical piece we had a good understanding of, obviously the technical piece we had a good understanding of, the market piece we were learning rapidly, the finance piece made a lot of sense. So it was most foreign, and obviously it's a pretty binary and essential element to being successful. So the concept of pursuing it was daunting, overwhelming, and before we learned more about it, felt like it was going to be a huge undertaking. Fortunately, it's actually not as complicated as it sounds. It's important that every step that you make along the way is done intentionally, and that you don't slip up. But I think once you start really digging in, it becomes a lot more easy to wrap your arms around. And then if you work with people who've been there, done that, particularly in your product category, your clinical space, a lot of the scary pieces can be made a little less scary. And then you can really figure out what the key elements are to focus on. And I think one of the best way to start reducing that level of concern is starting that pre-sub process and starting to develop a relationship with the review team and understand, what the key concerns are, how FDA perceives the risk of your technology, and be able to create a testing plan that not only provides the information you need for your product to be safe and effective, but to ensure that FDA's concerns are satisfied, and that's something that you can get a head start on versus getting a surprise later on in a marketing submission and have to then go back and start perhaps a long and expensive trial that you may not have the runway or funding for.
Yeah, I think, the hope of this panel and other things that we put on at JHTV is to hopefully help demystify the process a bit. I think it can be real daunting and scary, especially just the fear of the unknown, and help people understand, like, this is what you can expect, and here's what you should prepare for, so that you're not having to figure it out on your own.
Right.
Kelliann, I should mention, has been really helpful. She's put together a few guides for us, and we have a few documents on our digital library. We worked with a couple of our other mentors to flesh those out. So I guess it's a plug for that as well, for people who are new to the process. Peter, have you, that's probably safe to assume, had you been through this process before coming to Oncospace?
Yeah, I had, and and so had a lot of the other folks at Oncospace. We're a small team, but we're pretty, there's a few older folks like me in the team, and we've sort of been involved in getting 510Ks, particularly at other companies, both larger companies, like the sort of the Siemens G sort of level, down to startups. So we also have a regulatory consultant who is, absolutely fantastic, and it'd be quite a lot more of a challenge to do this without her. It's a reasonably well-worn path to get a 510K approved, but it can be daunting, to begin with. You kind of wonder where do you start? But if you have someone who's done it before, and you have a list of all the things that you need to provide, and you have a good idea of what's tripped you up in the past and the lessons you've learned, it's really not that bad a process, until you get down to kind of arguing with the FDA about things like your indications for use, and maybe we can talk more about that sort of thing. And that the FDA kind of tends to want to narrow you down in terms of your indications for use, and you as the company want to broaden it up as much as you can. And there's always that balance and a bit of negotiation. But yeah, I mean, I just at Oncospace, yeah, we haven't found it too difficult. We've got 2 FDA 510K approvals so far, and they've gone, thankfully, pretty smoothly.
I imagine, like many things, it gets a bit easier with experience and repetition.
It definitely.
You mentioned a few of the mistakes. Anything you're worth mentioning, or something that you didn't do this time around because you knew better?
Yeah, I guess just making sure you do a really complete submission, and don't try to sort of shortcut things, because it's just going to come back and bite you later. So with each of our submissions this time, and I'm sort of referring to mistakes at other companies where we perhaps haven't been as thorough. When you make the initial submission and then you kind of get delays, and we can anticipate pretty accurately the sorts of things they're going to want to know in terms of the things like verification and validation. And there's a difference between verification, which is kind of, does your product work as you designed it, versus validation, which is it going to be useful to customers? And you need to provide a lot of information on both of those counts. Particularly in the AI space where we are, it's all pretty new to us and new to the FDA as well. And we've had some really good, productive and friendly discussions with the FDA on exactly what the sort of validation material should should be. And we learned from the first submission that we got through the sort of things that we should include in the second one, the sort of data that we should submit. So the second one was quite a lot smoother and less back and forth than the first one was.
Thank you. Kelliann, I'm curious, when you are mentoring teams at Hopkins and it's their first time going through this, what are some of the questions that they bring to you, or some of is there a pattern for like recurring concerns?
Yeah, I think a very common question really is along the lines of, is this the right potential predicate that I'm considering? Is this the right pathway that I'm considering for this product? And it really revolves around that often. Other questions do sometimes revolve around data collection and what might be needed, but oftentimes that can be dictated in some ways by what the regulatory pathway is. So oftentimes I tried to help them maybe not focus on that right away, but then at the same time, though, not completely ignore it, because you do want to think about those things up front. But yes, oftentimes understanding the regulatory pathway early on is what I get from them.
And do you have any, I don't know, simple or high level advice for that right now that you could share? Like, how do you know? How do you help? What are some of the questions to help you determine that pathway?
Sure. So I think Peter said it really well, where he said in his reflection of finding someone who has done it before. That's kind of a way to generalize it, because oftentimes the exercises that I go through with them is a simple Google search if they're not entirely familiar with the FDA classification process based off of product codes. But that's because ideally they just need to find some sort of example to follow. And it may not be exactly the same product. Sometimes it can be similar. But oftentimes I try to simplify it as some technical characteristic of your product plus FDA in a Google search. And then you might find your competitor, and assuming that you're a really hardworking startup company, you probably already know who your competitor is and what their regulatory pathway is. So then that's why you get to that point where you already know what product code applies to your device. And really, I believe the product code is what holds the most value in understanding what regulatory processes will apply and to your device. And that's assuming that a product code exists. But of course, if one doesn't exist, that's also a little bit of an indication to show maybe this is a de novo or something that's a little different. So that's kind of some initial steps that I try to go through with the groups.
David, do you have any advice now, having been through it, for like, what's the first step? Is the first step reach out to the FDA? First step, reach out to a consultant? Or between those two audiences, as Kelliann mentioned some research you can do on your own, but then who do you go to?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend reaching out to the FDA until you've spoken with someone who's done it before. I think there's a lot of things you can avoid doing that could be challenging or catastrophic if you just go in first. So I think with limited support with a consultant and a lot of your own hard work, you can get a pretty nice initial pre-sub going. I think the first goal that we had and what we centered our first pre-sub around was validating a couple things. One was the regulatory pathway. Two was the predicate device or devices. And three is the V&V testing plan necessary to have adequate data for regulatory clearance. Because we felt that without that information, we couldn't raise money and we wouldn't know how much money to raise and what our timelines would be. And that sort of drives the Gantt chart of your business. Obviously, there are other things involved, but that's likely the longest pole in the tent, aside from any R&D efforts that still need to be completed. So I think, Kelliann's point about the product code is something that we leveraged quite a bit. So we actually, I'll never forget this, I spent almost a full week reading every single summary statement of every device in our product code to understand which products might be a good predicate. And we were incredibly fortunate that one of the several hundred, maybe over 1,000, had almost the same exact material as our implant and had nearly identical indications for use as what we were trying to show. It ended up not being an exact correlate or even a competitor, but it was close enough to give us the confidence that we would qualify for the 510K process. And having that background information is some of the information that's necessary to present to a consultant, for example, to say, hey, here's what we're thinking. Are we on the right track? How do we validate it? How do we present this in a pre-submission? And then you can also find in the summary statements, I don't remember what year they started doing this, but fairly recently, there's multiple pages of the testing that has been performed. Some of it's redacted, but a lot of it's not. You can see all of the benchtop, preclinical, and sometimes clinical data that people that came before you had done. And you can very easily say, all right, this applies to our technology. We should probably come up with some version of this, or that's not really relevant. Or, you know what, we're presenting something that wasn't really captured by this technology, and we need to make sure that we can prove that that's working as expected. So we need to figure out some test that's related to that. And then the final piece is there are a lot of testing standards from a number of different international organizations for various different types of technologies. And, you know, a perfect example is, you know, the biocompatibility. That's actually from the FDA. It's adopted, I think, from an IEC or an ISO standard. But there are a handful of things like sterilization, biocompatibility, electrical testing, things like that, or software guidance documents that can really inform a lot of your work in figuring out which of those guidance documents or standards apply to your technology, and then figuring out, you know, what type of testing you need to present the FDA associated with that, are sort of the core, I'd say, starting points for getting a pre-sub out the door. And we were very fortunate that basically we had a lot of, okay, nods, this makes sense, this makes sense, this makes sense. And then our big animal trial, there was some additional nuances that were asked for by the medical officer. And then there were some things that we thought maybe we'd get pushback on that we didn't. So it was very easy for us to say, hey, before we spend over $250,000 on this big, you know, pivotal animal trial, we're going to know that if we, you know, get the results that we're hoping for, that it's going to be adequate for FDA's expectations.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that sequence of events? When to go to the FDA? Like, how do you know when you're ready to start those conversations?
I agree with David. I think you should have some pretty good advice before you go to the FDA, because then you're sort of in the process, and kind of the clock starts ticking. And I mean, for us, we kind of pretty much knew things like the product category. You know, we could narrow it down to, I think, just 2 product codes. You know, we know that we're a treatment planning system, or, you know, related. We're in the code of a radiotherapy treatment planning system, because nothing else is as close as that. You know, and it doesn't exactly describe what we do, but it's the closest. And we've seen other systems that get by with that code, and so we settle on that. You know, we know we're a class 2 device because we're because anything that we'd consider as a predicate and other radiotherapy treatment planning system type companies are all class 2. You know, so the code and the classification, those are pretty straightforward to narrow it down to. So then you go to the FDA and you make your submission, and we've had questions come back about our validation, and it's mostly to do with things like the FDA will say, well, we think you're claiming a little too broad a scope here in terms of your intended use. That's a fairly common one that I've seen. You know, like as an example, in our case, we want to be able to say that our device works for any location in the body receiving radiation treatment. But the FDA will say, well, no, you've only tested it for prostate cancer, head and neck cancer, thoracic, and pancreas cancer. So that's what you have to say in your indications for use, that, you know, this is the scope of your product. And if you want to add other body sites, then you've got to show us the testing and, you know, have a list of 5 or 6 sites instead of 4 sites. And so that's the sort of negotiation you end up with. But as I said before, it's a bit of a trade-off there. You're trying to be as broad as possible. They want to narrow you down as much as possible. But you do have to stick to your guns and not be backed into a corner in terms of your intended use, because then you end up going back to them again more than you want to when you change. You want to change the scope of your product.
Kelliann, do you have any thoughts on the pre-submission process and I don't know how that dialogue can help and maybe how candid you can be during that?
Sure. Yeah. And so I think one thing that FDA always and still does is that they try to advocate submitting pre-submissions early on in your development process. And I'm not sure if a lot of companies do take advantage of that. When I was there, I did have the opportunity to work with a number of really early on groups and pre-submissions. And I personally, as a reviewer, really enjoyed it because one, it allowed me to establish a relationship with them very early. Even if it was just what they call an informational meeting type pre-submission, where you just provide a broad presentation of your product, and there's no expectation where FDA will provide feedback at that time. So I can understand where companies find that that's a time waster. But again, I think speaking as a reviewer, I enjoyed it working with those early companies, and I would say at those times, really, some schematics were hand drawn. They weren't even, AutoCAD or like really fancy, but it was enough to get the point across and how the FDA could understand how the product was going to work. And so I think that's, I hope that kind of helps companies understand, like, it doesn't always have to be that perfect, but as long as you can get it to a point where, just imagine someone who's not an expert in this product is looking at this product for the first time, just present it in a way that's easy to understand. And so I think the pre-submission is just a good way to break the ice through that way. Or if you do have more pointed questions, such as we're considering this regulatory pathway, that is something that you can get feedback on. But then ideally, you want to provide a justification for anything that you are asking about, essentially. And oftentimes, pre-subs are very good too to get FDA feedback on plans for testing or interpretation of data.
Yeah, I've got some more to add there. I think that's a really great point. We learned it was actually in getting our first IDE that there was just important information that was just not well understood by the review team. That was a function of the review team being busy, us sending in hundreds, if not over 1,000 pages of material, and it influencing feedback. And we were like, wait, we're not even talking about the same thing here. And what we've done in response to that, we've got a new product we've been working on. We submitted, we're pre-design controls for this new product. We've got a prototype, we've done some testing, but it's relatively early on in the design and development process. We did an informational meeting with the sole purpose of saying, hey guys, we know you've seen a bunch of other stuff from us that is over here. Some of the things in this new product are similar, some are different. A lot of those are going to have meaningful implications to how you're going to review those nuances. Let's talk about them and make sure we're all on the same page before we ask for specific feedback. And it's great because you're not, if you do the informational meeting first, it's all just about a get to know the technology. If you do a pre-sub first, it's all about, hey, we want to do this way, and here's why. Please tell me you agree. And it's just a different dynamic. And to Kelliann's point, I was surprised at how little detail FDA really needs to be able to provide some feedback and get familiar. For example, in our informational meeting, they asked us, I forget exactly what the specific question was, but the answer was, I don't know. It was like, does your product present this specific type of information? And the answer is, we're still testing whether we're going to include that module or not. And we said, we don't know. And that was fine. They said, okay, that's helpful for us to understand. If that's included, explain why it will be included. And if it's excluded, that's not a concern, but that might create a set of questions down the road. So we just found it's a great way to get to know new people and better understand. They start to ask questions. You can already see, okay, they're more worried about this versus that, and you can orient your next submission to provide more information related to those topics that had come up previously. And we were also, one other related point, we finally started having enough discussions with some of our review team where you start to actually develop a close enough relationship where there's a bit of chit chat either on the meeting officially or via email. And we've been encouraged quite a bit to just do more pre-subs just to keep more continuity and a sense of progress, similar to how when you're pitching investors, you don't go to them first meeting expecting them to write a check. You want to originally, introduce what you're doing, who you are, where you are heading, show that you're heading in that direction. Developing that context is very helpful. It's really the same process with FDA, and I don't think we fully appreciated that the first time we did it. It ended up not being a huge deal, but in retrospect, I think it would have made a lot of things much easier. And it's not really a waste of time or effort because everything that goes in that informational meeting is going to have to go into your next submission anyway. So you're just getting some of that work done ahead of time. And we've just been told multiple times that, hey, we appreciate these touch points. It's not additional burden for us. We want to hear from you and see where things are going. And it gives us a better understanding so that we feel like we're making the right decisions when we're guiding you on things. Because the worst thing that happens is there's a misunderstanding, you get guidance, and then later on you realize that there was a misunderstanding about what was presented. You do either the wrong thing or something that doesn't fully capture what FDA is going to ultimately need. And then you're in a really tight spot when you think, you're at the finish line and then you have to, go back another 20 yards or whatever.
Yeah, we were talking in our last panel like this. We were talking about cleaning up your cap tables, but we're saying you don't want to waste time or money as a startup. And so I think you guys are kind of touching on it too. Like, know what you need to do, be better prepared. I think, you don't want to spend a bunch of time spinning your wheels on something they don't need to see, or think you're done and you didn't address something that they are going to want to see, and then you got to go back to the drawing board. I'm curious, so how do you guys have mentioned a few things about predicate devices, and how do you kind of balance what we have is new and novel and amazing and different, but it's very similar to that, right? Like how do you toe that line? Anyone want to? Go ahead, Dave. You want to try to tackle that?
I'll start briefly based off my experience. I think FDA is first looking for safety, and then they're looking for effectiveness, in my experience. A safety risk is much more concerning than the lack of effectiveness in my mind. And I think when FDA is looking at any sort of new submission, they're saying, how can this go wrong and hurt a patient? So my view is, while there may be other things that make this better, faster, whatever, as long as the same types of risks exist to the patient, I think it's easy to say, hey, this is a reasonable predicate. We can follow that same type of testing structure. The intended use piece, I've seen there's actually been less of a hard line in terms of saying, hey, it's similar sort of technology. It's applied a little bit differently, but it's a similar gist. I've seen that there's been more flexibility there. But from a safety perspective, like if you're coming up with some whole brand new material, that's a much bigger issue, I view, at FDA than saying, hey, we're using the same material or the same type of technology and doing something a little bit different with it. That's a unique insight or a unique way that it's integrated into the workflow or something of that nature. So I'd say as long as you've got a really strong risk argument with your predicate, I've seen FDA to be receptive to that.
Peter, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this has perhaps been the most surprising thing to me, with going through regulatory submissions, is that, you get so wrapped up in the details of your own product and you think it's totally unique and it's different to you look for a predicate device and no, it's not really like that. It's not really like that. But the FDA is usually kind of thinking at a less detailed level than you. And, to be honest, the device we have as a predicate, in my mind, it's quite different. But yeah, it is all about risks to the patient. And if you can make a good case that the risks to the patient are the same, the same bad decisions could be made using their product versus your product, or good decisions, hopefully. But the predicate can be something that really suits you, and that there's look for a good summary statement that kind of rings true to you as well, with the same risks and indications for use that are, or the intended use, which is very similar, and that's often at a much higher and less detailed level than how you think about your product. So yeah, it isn't too difficult to find a suitable predicate device, and often, it's a good education in sort of how you need to think of your product at a sort of a risk analysis level versus at a feature level.
Kelliann, I imagine you now have seen this a bit from both sides, having spent time at JHTV, where we're analyzing prior art and patents and what is novel, and then having been at FDA. Do you have any thoughts on navigating that?
I mean, I feel like both David and Peter really hit the nail on the head in terms of what FDA's main mission is, which is, to make sure there's safe and effective products out there. So I think the risk-based approach is definitely one I think is aligned with either, I guess, at least my experience from the FDA. From the inventor standpoint, I can understand where it's tough to want to see your baby be compared to something else. You know what I mean? That's like so special. And so I think that I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I try to, help them understand, like, it's still a really cool product. And I just remember this is not necessarily a reflection of its utility. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is kind of understanding that this is just a paradigm that the FDA operates under in many ways. So, and just also understanding that is what will happen with the FDA process versus the patenting process. And that's always something that I've wondered how they deal with this, because and one bit of advice I also give to companies is, because sometimes as a reviewer, I'd see patent language leak into their 510(k) submissions, or submit different submissions, and it would confuse us because it would often be much broader than what they were proposing as an indications for use. So as a simple thing to avoid, I would say try to just vet your submissions and not reuse those type of documents, just because it just becomes a really small source of confusion. But I can understand they're just different approaches, because when you're patenting, you're trying to cast a wide net, right? So, but just understanding they're two very different processes.
But it's nice to hear what both David and Peter said from sort of the start of the inventor, the applicant side of it, because in years past, we had folks from the FDA actually shadow some startups to try to understand what the process is like from the entrepreneur and the startup side. And that anecdotally, the FDA folks said, well, if it works and it's safe, it's somewhat simple maybe, or straightforward. I'm not saying it's easy, right? But I think that, if what you're saying will work and not hurt people, then the process should be more straightforward. So it's nice to hear that that's actually been the experience from David and Peter.
Mark, I have sort of an unrelated couple of anecdotes that I think might
Sure.
be helpful to share. One thing there's sort of two things that we've done that I didn't sort of realize existed until we went through it. The first of which is sort of follow-up meetings after the 1 hour that you're granted for either a pre-IDE or a pre-sub. So one of the great things about FDA is they have this pre-sub opportunity to be able to submit information and get feedback. One of the challenging issues is you wait 3 months and you get an hour of time. You're trying to talk about a ton of really critical things, and you have a bunch of people on the call, and everybody's using the time as they see fit, which may not be in your best interest. So every team is different, but I wasn't aware of the fact that you can really ask for either written correspondence via email afterwards, or have another meeting scheduled shortly after your initial meeting to basically finalize some of the pending topics that you made some progress on, but weren't able to fully get alignment on. We've done that, I think, after every single pre-sub. We've had some follow-up correspondence beyond the meeting minute documentation, which is super important to do. That without asking for that, I feel like we would have been pretty disappointed with the result of that first hour. But after saying, hey, you were confused about this, here's one more one-pager summarizing what you were asking about. We want to make sure we have agreement on X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And either scheduling a meeting or having an email correspondence to clarify that. I would strongly recommend, if needed, to know that that's an option. Kelliann may know more about sort of what is or isn't kosher. And I don't know if we were outside the lines at all with what we'd asked for, but it ended up working for us. And then second, some of these reviewers will attend clinical conferences. And while they're going there as, an FDA representative, we found that they actually really like to be engaged and have some less formal discussions, and not only just to get to know you piece, but just to bounce a couple ideas off of folks where it's not written down, it doesn't have a full scrutiny, but just sort of a gut check on some things that you're thinking about. And now that FDA, to my knowledge, they're not doing in-person meetings anymore. That was really a nice show and tell opportunity to bring your device, shake people's hands. So you can sort of schedule that off the cuff at these clinical conferences. So it may be helpful either once you get their email addresses and when you talk to them during a pre-sub meeting, say, hey, which conferences do you end up going to? Maybe we can connect live at one of the upcoming conferences that we'll also be at. We found to be a helpful tool.
Well, thanks, David, and feel free to interject with anecdotes because I have some things I think we ought to talk about, but you guys will know far better than I do. So I'll follow your leads. Is it generally safe to assume that you talked about risk to the end user, oftentimes the patient, higher the risk, the higher the burden, the more sort of trials, more patients, more everything is going to go into this process?
Yeah.
It seems obvious, but I just want to make sure that I've heard Kelliann speak recently about sort of the different classes of devices. Similarly, she briefly touched on therapeutics as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, yeah, oftentimes the answer to that question is that seems like the common trajectory. But I think also one misconception I did want to clarify sometimes is that so everyone kind of assumes that PMAs always need a clinical study. 510Ks likely don't need a clinical study. De novos, some don't need them, some do. I think I've actually heard more from some of my groups as a mentor, this assumption that de novos don't need clinical data or are actually a little easier than 510Ks in some ways too, which I thought was very interesting to hear. And so I think that, I don't want to say easier, but in terms of like data burden. And so one misconception I did want to clarify is that it is possible to require a clinical study in a 510K and a de novo and PMA. So, but that's where the research on what product code applies to your product is really helpful, because then you can look if your competitors did a clinical study or were required to collect some sort of clinical information. And then with de novos, I think, I'm not quite sure how to clarify that, but I wouldn't necessarily think that, I don't want the conception to be that there's less data burden there in some ways too.
Yeah, so I think a related topic that, Mark, we first talked about demystifying the process. There's regulatory, which is what we're talking about now, and there's quality, and there are parts that overlap. And one of the things that we did that was risk related that I would recommend that everyone do, that relates to both regulatory and quality, is actually mapping out your risk matrix. So part of a quality document that goes into regulatory submissions is your risk analysis. And you have to basically come up with all of the different types of risks and rank them based off of the likelihood that they will happen and the severity of the harm that they could induce. So that, in addition to a traceability matrix, which really maps out the user needs, the design inputs, design outputs, and verification validation testing, is, I would recommend, the first place to start before you even start really thinking about regulatory path. You can do them in parallel, but it is what's going to drive all of your testing, and it will make sure that you have a comprehensive assessment of what you think needs to happen. And you'll certainly miss things and you'll slide things in later, but it is a great way to understand, hey, look, we've all sort of realized that the highest severity risk is X. We better have some really clean V&V testing to minimize that risk that is going to make us feel comfortable and the FDA comfortable. And that's a helpful way to understand, maybe is a clinical trial necessary, maybe not. How do we design it? And that's where it's, yeah, you can look at the product codes in the past to see what other people have done, but at the end of the day, the reviewer is going to have a personal opinion based off of their gestalt on all of the many hundreds of products that they've reviewed that you have no idea what their past experience is, and they're going to draw from that and say, you know what, we've seen these types of issues with related products. We want to feel really comfortable that this isn't going to happen with your product. Let's figure out a testing plan to overcome that. So bottom line is a traceability matrix and a risk analysis draft is a great thing that you as a team can start doing before you spend a lot of money on consultants or reach out to FDA that can help organize all of these different pieces.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And, having a good process in place for documenting the hazards and hazardous situations and linking those back to, user stories and acceptance criteria and not skimping on that. I mean, we spend an awful lot of time on that sort of thing and having meetings and making sure that we've brainstormed all of the hazards that exist, and not pretending that there's not hazards. And even if a lot of them just come back to something simple like there may be delay in patient treatment, but we end up with an enormous spreadsheet of hazards and acceptance criteria and user stories, and the FDA likes to see that you've put a lot of thought into that. So yeah, that's very important. And having just even something simple like having a good environment, like we use just a plug for Microsoft Azure DevOps that we do that within. It's great. If you try to do it all manually, it's a nightmare. But having that as automated as possible and getting the whole team on board and working in that environment is a big help.
I wonder if we can touch on software specifically, and we kind of tie that to the risks and the intended uses. Kelliann, do you have any general advice, maybe, or distinction between a software that may accompany a medical device versus software that's meant to be a clinical decision tool, or that accompanies a diagnostic? And this, how does that impact the kind of risk and the planning with the FDA?
Well, so I think it ultimately will depend on how that software is being used, whether it's interfacing with hardware or if it's operating as a software product alone, which is maybe a little bit of a newer topic that's been about in regulatory news and everywhere, really, but or SAMD, what they refer to it as. And so I think there was probably some need to distinguish that like a software only product can still be considered a medical device, because there could be misconception that it wasn't regulated if it wasn't hardware, because it didn't meet that definition I referred to earlier that FDA identifies as a medical device. And so as a result, FDA has defined what software as a medical device would be considered. And I think the understanding is that they would undergo similar regulatory processes, whether it's 510K, de novo, PMA, and it really just depends on what that use is. So something that I'll note that something that predicts or diagnoses, things that kind of have a higher weight in clinical impact, I believe, like you can equate that in a way to risk level and whether it would be considered something new as compared to a product that's already regulated. So like in that distinction of 510K versus a de novo. But those type of claims are also ones that I guess it really comes down to risk, because if that product doesn't diagnose or predict it correctly, then that patient either, gets a completely incorrect treatment or no treatment at all. So, so that's one way to look at it. But the idea is that they are regulated products.
Go ahead, David. Looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, we looked into this quite a bit, and Kelliann, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think the fact that it's software or not is probably the least relevant part of the whole analysis. I think you have to look at it like it's this black box device that does X. Your indication is X, how it works is Y, and the implication of if there's something that malfunctions is Z. What do you need to do to test that and minimize that risk? And whether that's an implant, an imaging device, software only, or something else, there may be additional considerations, but the implication on the patient is really what drives all of the effort.
Peter, this is potentially a very big topic that we cannot cover orally, but how is the AI machine learning aspect impacting things, right? This is kind of you guys have mentioned this is an evolving process, and how have you been able to navigate that dialogue with the FDA?
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating area to be in. Both in terms of the possibilities of AI and sort of the way that the evolving regulatory environment. AI is very different to other software devices in that it can potentially learn it can potentially learn on the job. So the traditional paradigm for software as a medical device is that you characterize your device and you prove that it has a certain risk profile and these risks are mitigated, and that applies to the device that you get 510K'd or whatever pathway you're going through, and the traditional paradigm is that the device doesn't change, and if it does change, then you do a new submission. But the FDA totally appreciates that part of the potential of AI devices is that they can improve perhaps every day. They can. You could potentially have feedback from the clinic that goes into your device, and you improve the key is that you could improve the device's performance, and that shouldn't be held back. That should be something that, for the benefit of everyone, including the patients, you should allow these devices to improve. But that also has to fit within a regulatory framework. And they're kind of two opposing forces in a sense, but the FDA has very sensibly put a lot of time and effort into coming up with guidelines to allow AI devices to be not too heavily regulated while still maintaining safety. And one way they've done that is they've come up with a part of the technical submission for a 510K is that you can put in a thing called a predetermined change control plan, which describes the things that you anticipate wanting to change in your product, but not go through a whole new 510K. So we haven't done this yet. This is one thing that we will have to do in the next few months, is come up with one of these predetermined change control plans where we'll say, look, we anticipate that we will want to, for example, build new AI models using customer data and not just the data that we've collected, the Hopkins data that we've based our current AI models on. So we'll have to prove to the FDA that we are going to build these new models safely, and here are the tests that we're going to do. Here's the validation, external validation tests that we're going to do, and the FDA then hopefully says, yep, we're confident that you, as a company, understand all of the things that need to be done to keep your product safe without us seeing it again, without us seeing a new FDA submission, because it's not practical that AI devices will every time you update the model for whatever reason, you would have to go back for a new 510K. So, I mean, it's really great to see that the FDA really does appreciate this, and I think there's good progress being made. And even just very recently, the last couple of months, there's new guidelines have come out that are going to help this process along.
I think you've done an admirable job there summarizing a very complex and rapidly evolving topic.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure to ask you about that, because we had a similar conversation about diagnostics recently, and there was some frustration about having what's known as a locked assay submitted to the FDA when you could continually be gathering more data, improving the process, and your algorithm could be getting better, and the frustration of then having to go back and not be able to update that or restarting the process over. I'm curious, with the time we've got remaining, if each of you might want to share, maybe start with David, something you know now that you wish you knew when you started the process.
I think I'm having trouble figuring out one thing that I really wish I knew, but I think what I said about the design controls and risk analysis is probably, like, there was all this inertia for me just diving in, and I would have just started there, tried to map everything out, and engage the FDA probably a little bit earlier than we did, and make sure that we had a defined process, and really you can start with a template and reading about it. And I know there are a lot of online guides available, but that's the best place to start. And I think it took us a long time to really get that rolling. And we had this intuition that we needed the device to be sort of locked in from a design freeze perspective before we could really start all this stuff. And that was a really bad assumption. So basically, as soon as you start designing the device, it's prudent to start thinking about design matrix and risk analysis. And you then factor that into all of the design changes you're making. And then it's also helpful to factor in that exercise we were talking about with Kelliann about what's in the product code, what else has gone before you. When it comes to things like material selection or indications, you can see, okay, well, what has been successful in the past? And you can probably save yourself a lot of time and heartache by factoring in some of that background information that's publicly available before picking important decisions about your product.
Peter, any last sort of words of caution or wisdom?
I mean, I guess to be honest, at Oncospace, we've kind of started from a pretty good place, and we haven't made too many mistakes because we just had as I said, we have an excellent consultant, and but probably between our first and second submission, I think the first time we probably didn't submit enough kind of really rigorous sort of scientific data on the performance of our machine learning models, particularly. The second time we did that, we have an excellent lead data scientist who comes from an academic background, at Hopkins, and her scientific rigor is priceless, and she knows how to do a good statistical analysis, and the sort of thing that I mean, you should do anyway, but the FDA likes that sort of thing. That you're a company, but you also know what you're doing scientifically and statistically, particularly. And so, yeah, I mean, that's certainly, in any future submissions, put that effort in up front. Make sure you show that you know what you're doing, and you're not cutting any corners, and your product really is a good piece of science.
And Kelliann, I realize now I've gone over the top of the hour, so I want to respect all of your time. Do you have any parting thoughts or way to wrap this up?
No, I mean, again, I appreciate all the comments that both David and Peter shared, and I'm very happy for them that they were able to get their clearances and their products on the market. So that's great, and great to hear that the FDA experience also hopefully was a good one for you. And I think hopefully anyone else who's listening, just remember FDA are a bunch of people who are really interested in technology too. So having been one myself, just don't be afraid to reach out to them.
Well, thank you all. And we always run out of time. It's too much to talk about in an hour, but I really appreciate Kelliann, Peter, and David taking time today and sharing this I'll send the link around to past recordings to people who registered, and look for future panels coming up throughout the year.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much,
guys.
Mark. Nice to meet you
Have a
all.
great day.